am Dr. Lorna Lancaster, and I'm at the University of Lincoln in the UK, United Kingdom. And it's a very cold and frosty morning today. And I think actually some of the microbes that are outside will be hiding because it's a bit too cold for them this morning. So it's morning here where I am. So I am at the University of Lincoln in the School of Pharmacy, and I work on bacteria and how we can get rid of the bad bacteria but not kill off the good bacteria. And that's something that I work on in my job, and also teaching pharmacists all about infections and again how we can use good bacteria and bad bacteria. But today we're going to be working on how we can use microbes to produce food. And how to prevent bad bacteria in our food as well. Okay, so here we go. So microbes in food. Okay, so how are microbes involved in our food? We're going to be looking at that today. We're also going to be looking at which type of microbes might be involved. We're going to be looking at what types of food might be involved and what are scientists doing to make our food yummier or how to make our food better for us. And so we don't get ill from them. There's lots of work going on all of these different topics. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. But just a little bit of an overview of what is microbiology. Now, we had some brilliant words in the word cloud earlier, but I'm going to break it down into a little bit of bigger or smaller groupings. And we're going to be talking about a few of these today. So the study of microbiology is organisms that you need a microscope to diagnose or to observe. So within that field, we have it broken down into three different groups. We have eukaryotes, prokaryotes, and acellular. Okay, so eukaryotes are actually, it's the type of cell that they have. These are big, complex cells. And humans have eukaryotic cells, but there are also microbes that have eukaryotic cells, and these include fungi and algae, or small multi-celled organisms and protozoa that are parasites. We are not going to really talk about parasites today. There are parasites involved in food, mostly causing illness and damage, but we're not going to really talk about them today. But we will be talking about fungi, so that will be interesting. Then there's prokaryotes, and when we talk about microorganisms, this is probably where our mind goes to more, and that's talking about bacteria. And you can have archaea, but these tend to be extremophiles, so they tend to be living in really wild and adventurous places, like in Antarctica. So we won't be talking about them. The bacteria we like to talk about in food tend to be able to survive in our environment where humans can survive. Then there's acellular, which is viruses, and these, well, there is still debate of whether they're alive or not, but they don't really have a cell. They only have what's known as DNA and a structure beyond that. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're mostly going to be focusing on fungi and bacteria, though, in the world of food. So this is some of the different cell structures or acellular structures that we're going to be looking at. So we've got the eukaryotic cell, and this is a lot larger, so they've all been scaled up to different size to look the same size, but they really aren't the same size. So the eukaryotic cell is about 100 times bigger than the prokaryotic cell. And it's got a complex cell with lots of different membrane-bound organelles. And it has a membrane-bound nucleus in the center, and it has lots of complex mechanisms going on, and that's important when understanding what microorganism you're looking at. You've then got the prokaryotic cell, and these are quite simple creatures. It's like a big bag of jelly, and within that they have their DNA, and they have some ribosomes, and they have some little sacs of material, but beyond that they don't have much else, and then they have quite a complex membrane around it. And then about 100 to 1,000 times smaller than that, we have a virus. This is a picture of a bacteriophage, and it looks a little bit like an alien. And it has a protein structure on the outside, and then DNA in the center, or maybe RNA. And that is about it. It's a very simple structure, but it can be used in many different ways, including keeping humans enclosed in sometimes. But within food, it can be used in a beneficial way for humans. So we're going to be maybe talking a little bit about that as well. So they're the different types of microbes we're going to be looking at, or the cells of the microbes we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to start off with looking at how microbes are involved in the growth of food. So you wouldn't have thought that microbes could be involved in growing food, but they are. So actually plants and trees invented the World Wide Web. So before we had the internet, plants were already doing this. And they have a very clever fungus. So it's called mycorrhizal fungi. And they grow underground. And they grow between the roots of trees and plants. So within forests, underneath the ground, there is this pattern and network of mycorrhizal fungi that move between or grow between the roots of the trees and the plants. When a tree or plant is maybe attacked by a parasite or an insect, or it's found a really good food source that's suddenly appeared, or it's getting old and it knows it's going to be dying soon, or if it's the mother tree and it wants to protect its new saplings, they release chemicals into their roots. Those chemicals go into the soil, and then the mycorrhizal fungi take in those chemicals and they pass it through the pipework to tell the neighbours what's going on. So it means that some trees, if they know that there's a parasite coming, they can release chemicals to protect themselves from the parasite, or they can maybe start growing to be able to move towards or grow towards the food source that may be coming soon if a plant is dying. So this is really clever, and the mycorrhizal fungi has a special network to be able to do this. And the mycorrhizal fungi actually benefit from this as well, because when trees and plants die, they get food from the dead plants. That's very much from the dead plant. And then they can break down that dead plant and then feed the trees again. So they live in a symbiotic way. So this is mycorrhizal fungus. They are obligate aerobes, and they grow at 25 to 30 degrees Celsius. Okay. And they don't move, they grow towards the food. So over here in the blue picture, this is a microscopic view of the fungus, and you can see the tubes known as a hyphae, and that's where the fungus grows towards. And then you've got a sporangiophore, and that's where all this spores are, and that's how the fungi generate more fungal growth cells. Okay, and then you can see over here in the white, it looks like a big web, and that's the fungal growth around the roots of a tree. So you can see it really looks like a web, and this grows all the way through the soil. There is some research going on that they're finding that not ploughing up fields when they're growing their wheat or their corn is better than ploughing it up and breaking all of these webs. So if you don't plough the fields, you can actually see that these webs maintain their structure, and then the new plants can grow with this web already in place. So
Lorna, we have two questions maybe. If you can, yeah. So maybe the first question, if you can explain to our audience what are obligate anaerobes, because I think this is a new term for everybody.
Okay, so you can get obligate anaerobes and obligate aerobes. So obligate anaerobes is when you actually have they cannot have oxygen. I'm actually thinking I might have typed in wrong. They're actually obligate aerobes. I should correct myself. They're obligate aerobes, And that means that they have to have oxygen. So yeah, I mistyped. I do apologize.
No worries. Thank you so much. The other very interesting thing that Bhavik mentioned when you talked about plants and microbes was nitrogen fixing bacteria. So are these bacteria also present in and around this web? Do they work with the fungus, or are they completely separate from them?
I would suggest that they probably work with the fungus as well, because you might find out in the biofilm in the future. So yeah, they all work together. Yeah, I don't really talk about the nitrogen fixing in this one. But because the nitrogen fixing is important, but they are less symbiotic to the plant, whereas the fungus is very much symbiotic. So, yeah.
Perfect. So symbiosis. Can you just maybe in one line summarize what symbiosis means for these plants and fungus for everybody again?
Yeah, so symbiosis is where two organisms that are separate, but they live together and they have beneficial things from the other organism. So each organism gains from each one being there. So the fungus gains food from the plant because the plant is making food from light and from oxygen and carbon dioxide and water, and that passes through the roots and comes out as well. But also the tree or the plant has fallen leaves or dies and has branches and leaves that die and fall in, and the organism can then live from that food. That the fungus then breaks down that dead material and then puts that as carbon dioxide, but also other materials back into the plant as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we can move ahead now.
Okay, thank you. Good questions coming. Okay, so we have different mycorrhizal species for different plants. Okay, so ectomycorrhiza, these tend to be involved more in the plant nutrition, and are mostly found around trees and forests. You then have endomycorrhiza, which is more about soil nutrition, and they then so when it's plants where there's a little bit more death and growth, rather than maybe just leaves coming off. This is more plants die and regrow new ones. This helps with the soil nutrition so that new plants can regenerate. And all of these help protect the plants from invasive fungi and pests. So the more good fungi you have around, the less space there is for the bad fungus. And also, again, that release of chemicals so the plants can be warned when a bad fungus is coming and release chemicals to be able to defeat the bad fungus, which is a really good thing.
So we have one more question from Geraldine, which is a great question again. Can the same fungus spread from the mother plant to the sapling?
Yeah, so a lot of the time saplings will be within the environment of the tree. They tend to fall off the tree and land. A lot of the time, especially on fruit trees, we're just going to talk about that. We need the fungus to break down that fruit to release the seeds. The seeds are put into the soil, and the fungus will then grow towards the food. So by the tree providing food, that actually allows the fungus to grow towards the new seed to then be able to grow towards the new seeds and the new saplings. So yeah, it's all part of the same network.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So as I was just talking about, we do also have the fungus that break down fruits. And although in a forest or in an orchard, we need that to help the growth of new trees in nature, what it can be is a little bit bad for our storage of food. And so we have microbes that break down our food. So again, it is important in nature, or we'd have food and waste everywhere in our forest. And we'd be surrounded by leaves and dead trees, but we don't. But it does mean that we have to consider spoilage of food as well when it comes to microbes. And as you can see, some of our strawberries and peaches and apples and cucumber maybe or a courgette, being broken down by fungus. And these are mostly penicillins, or penicillium, and aspergillus. Penicillins or penicilliums produce antibiotics. And so they actually reduce bacterial growth around them because they want to have the food for themselves, not the bacteria. But we can actually use those penicilliums to make antibiotics for us, which is really useful. Aspergillus is also there. It's not, or it can be problematic because it can produce toxins, which can cause some health problems as well. But they are both really useful microorganisms in getting rid of waste. But sometimes we do have to protect our fruit and vegetables from them as well. Okay. So I was going to ask if anybody's got any further questions. That was where I was going to pause. Is there any further questions from anyone?
No, I think we've just taken the most recent questions. So we can move ahead and then we'll come back when we have a few more questions.
Fabulous. Okay, so that's in some of the growth of foods. We're now going to look into some of the foods in food destruction or food production. So I don't know about you, but sometimes I don't want to have meat. And certainly in the UK, you may have it as well. There's another fungus that's used to make corn. And this is what we use as a meat substitute sometimes. And the microbe is called Fusarium venenatum. And it's found in the soil all over the world. And when making corn, it's grown in broth. So this is a nutrient-rich liquid. And it's grown at about 28 to 30 degrees Celsius because it's found in the soil. It likes quite cool temperatures compared to human beings. And then it's mixed in with some egg whites. And this makes like a meat-like product. So it's a little bit chewy and a little bit tasty. And it has this quite novel taste. It tastes a little bit like chicken if you've had chicken.
So this is a great way to eat something that tastes like meat but isn't meat.
Yeah, and I think as it sounds like a Harry Potter spell. It certainly does. And it is, as we talk a little bit about environmental ways of carbon dioxide in the world, this is one of the ways that we can do it by actually using the microbe to grow a meat substitute, and a very tasty way to do it as well. So then we have, so that's some corn, but we also use fungus to make bread. And somebody mentioned this in the word cloud earlier. And yes, we do very much make fungus to make bread. And this is the big fluffy bread that we all love. We have, this is a yeast, which is slightly different. It's single cellular, rather than growing in the hyphae of long strands. It grows a little bit more like bacteria, but it's bigger. So it's about 100 times bigger than a bacterial cell, but it's a single cell rather than growing in long strands, as we've seen earlier. So you can see the picture there of the little, they look like blobs. And coming out of that is little buds, and this is new cells that are growing out of the adult or the fully grown cells. So this is how they grow and divide. Okay, so we add our yeast with some sugar and some flour and a little bit of warmth, and the glucose from the sugar, along with some oxygen, creates carbon dioxide and water. And if anybody wants to look at the chemical formula, you've got 6 carbons breaking down into 6 carbon dioxides and some water molecules. And the creation of the carbon dioxide makes the bubbles in the bread and the bread dough. And that helps the bread to rise and to give this really nice fluffy texture to make some nice, lovely bread. And it also gives a really nice smell as well.
That looks really good, the bread. So next time, if you're having yummy, fluffy bread, you have to say thank you to all these yeast.
Yes, exactly. Yes, they're breaking down of sugar, makes some lovely yummy bread, and again makes that really nice smell of nice baking bread. Yeah. We can also use microbes for making cheese. Sometimes you can use vinegar or lemon juice, but most commonly we use cheese because that makes the best tasting cheese. Okay, so they have the most common bacteria we use for making cheese that are added to the milk are Lactococcus, Lactobacillus, and Streptococcus. Okay. And what they do is they take the carbohydrates or the sugars that are in the milk and they turn that into lactic acid. Okay, and the lactic acid then lowers the pH of the milk, which then unfolds a protein, which is coloured here at the bottom, this sort of little ribbon picture. And it unfolds a casein, which then clumps together. And these protein clumps bring in the fats from the milk and create the curds to make cheese. So depending on what type of cheese you want to make will depend on the best bacteria that you want to select. If you want a really hard cheese, you pick one that actually lowers the pH further to get bigger clumps that can create a hard cheese. If you want a softer cheese, you want one that maybe doesn't produce as much lactic acid to have that less clumping together and you get a nice soft cheese. So scientists look at what type of cheese they want to really think about what kind of the amount of acid that's produced to then create the cheese that they want. But we can also use those microbes for making stinky cheese. And the original starter cultures also create flavour. Okay? So when you just use lemon juice or vinegar, you tend to get quite milky flavoured cheese. Whereas when you have some of the bacteria, you get different flavours again, but depending on what bacteria you have present. So they break down, the bacteria use the dairy protein. And so the casein as well as others. So they take the protein and they can either break it down into methionine or they can break it down into modified amino acids. And they do one or the other. From methionine, you can produce sulfur compounds, and that makes a particularly eggy kind of flavour. If you go down modified amino acids, these can then create hydroxyl acids, carboxylic acids, or aldehydes. And all of these create smell and flavour that your senses can pick up and make particularly flavoursome cheese. Sometimes they can be particularly stinky, depending on the cheese that you like. To make flavour and also to add to the texture of the cheese and to create the really individual cheeses that we can get nowadays, we also have adjunct cultures. And these are cultures that we don't need to make the actual curds. We use them to make the flavour and to add to the texture of the cheese. So for example, we have Lactobacillus helveticus, which is made to create a very sweet flavour in cheese. We've got Propionibacterium freudenreichii, and this actually produces holes in Swiss cheese. So in the picture at the top, we have big holes in the cheese slice. And this is usually how you see cheese in cartoons and things. So the bacteria, so the Propionibacterium, grow in the cheese, and when they are breaking down the sugars within the cheese, they create carbon dioxide, a bit like in bread, but they also bury themselves into the cheese, and when they release the gas and the carbon dioxide, it creates these bubbles within the cheese once it's solidified, creating these very identifiable holes. If you like some camembert or brie, they use Penicillium camembert. And this is the white mold on the surface, and this is used to add flavour as well. But it also protects the cheese in the centre, so you can store it for a long time there's a layer of this mold around the outside, which protects the delicate cheese, but also adds some really nice flavors into the cheese as well. And if you like a bit of blue cheese, some Roquefort, Penicillium Roquefort or Roqueforti, and this creates the blue mold around cheese. And this also protects the cheese when they're living. Originally, when cheese was made and they were stored in caves, this is where the blue mold protected the cheese from other bacteria and from anything that could make the cheese go off. So this is one way that we can go about that.
So we have some questions in the chat window. One question is from Aaron. He asked, do the microbes which are in the food, are they also involved when the food gets spoiled?
So we're going to talk about this in a minute, but these tend to not spoil the food. They tend to be quite healthy, and they actually help protect the food. They stop, so because they create this layer, they stop some of the spoilage bacteria and fungi from getting in.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Yeah, yeah.
So
we'll talk about some of the spoilage ones in a minute.
Perfect. So Ala had another question. Her question was, do the fungi that spoil our fruit and vegetables, are they sometimes particular or specific? So only a certain kind of fungi will grow on a certain type of fruit or vegetable? Or is it just one type of fungi that spoils everything?
You probably have a little bit of a mixture. There are certain bacteria and fungi that will grow in certain areas and on certain foods, and then there are some that are everywhere. So Penicillium, and also you will find the same overall family that will probably grow on everything, but there might be specific species that will stick to a specific fruit or vegetable, or a lot of it will depend on the area, a lot of it will depend on weather. So here in the UK we have inclement weather, so it kind of changes quite a lot, whereas if you're somewhere it might stay the same, you might have a very different fungal growth.
That sounds really interesting. All right, so I think we've answered the two questions that have popped up in the chat window, so maybe we can go ahead and then we'll come back when we have some more questions.
Okay, lovely. So that's the cheesy, so that's the adjunct cultures. But we have lots of microbes in soft cheese in particular. And so we have some good bacteria, and we have some good fungus, and we also have some bad bacteria, as we were just talking about. For making soft cheese in particular, we have Lactococcus lactis. We have Bifidobacterium species, we have Bacteroides species, and we have Lactobacillus species. Similar to Lactococcus and Lactobacillus, they're just slightly different structure. One is round circles and one's a long, thin rod. These are all bacteria that are either added into the cheese to make the curds, or they're bacteria that are found naturally in milk. And in milk, there is bacteria there which are used to by the mother to provide bacterial nice gut intestinal bacteria for the calf, or in humans the baby. So all milk has natural bacteria that are non-pathogenic that we use to create our intestinal bacterial colonies. And so all of those are in the cheeses that are made, and so that's why sometimes there's different flavors depending on where the cheese is made. There are also then the adjunct bacteria or fungus, and in this case for soft cheeses you've got Penicillium camembert. But there are also some bad bacteria that can also come potentially from the milk or from the environment. So some of the bad ones that can be within soft cheeses are Staphylococcus aureus, Listeria monocytogenes, and Clostridium botulinum. Clostridium botulinum doesn't grow particularly happily, but it can in very, it's an obligate anaerobe, so only grows when there's no oxygen at all. So we don't come across this that often. However, you may have heard of Botox, and this is a bacteria that produces the toxin that does, Botox. And it's a very, very potent toxin, and it's probably one of the most potent toxins in the world. But we can enhance that to have our lines taken out of our skin, or sometimes if we need any plastic surgery from injury as well. But what I'm going to talk about next is the bacteria Listeria monocytogenes, and this is one of the biggest factors within cheese, because most people, if you are fit and healthy, won't really notice Listeria around. However, if you have a condition where your immune system doesn't work as well, or if you're pregnant, it can cause some troubles. So I'm just going to go back a little bit. Okay. So Listeria monocytogenes is a bacteria that causes food poisoning. And symptoms can be similar to food poisoning, but it can enter the blood and cause septicemia or meningitis. And this is particularly problematic for pregnant women. Okay. So I'm just going to go back a little bit. So microbes actually produce a protein which protects cheese from pathogenic or spoilage bacteria. Okay. So some of these microbes produce them on their own, but actually we've had scientists also add some of these into the starter cultures to produce these proteins to actually protect the cheese from these bacteria. Okay. And these proteins are known as bacteriocins. And bacteriocins are proteins produced by bacteria. And we know that we found that 99% of bacteria produce bacteriocins, and they kill off different bacteria depending on the competition that might be in their natural environment. So Lactococcus and Enterococcus live in a world alongside Listeria. So the bacteriocin niacin, which is produced by Enterococcus and Lactococcus, is actually produced to actually kill off Listeria in the natural world. So we've, as scientists, created bacteria that specifically produce this bacteriocin, so that when we're producing the cheese, this bacteriocin is around, so that the cheese is less likely to produce Listeria into the cheese. So this is a picture of what niacin looks like with all the ribbons. It's a really small protein, and it punctures the cell membrane of the bacteria, and that means that it can't grow, and it can't take in the nutrients that it needs, and it loses the jelly-like substance in the middle. Okay. Does anybody have any questions at that stage?
I don't see any questions in the chat window.
Okay.
But Ananya had a question about rusk biscuits. And she asks, do they also have microbes on them? So basically, do all kinds of food have microbes on them?
So microbes are everywhere. We can't get rid of them. Rusks are fairly dry. So there doesn't tend to be pathogenic bacteria within them. Pathogenic bacteria need to have, they tend to need to have the environment that our bodies live in. That's not to say they're not there, but it tends to be rust, but you can store them usually for quite a long time because they're dry, and bacteria can't grow in dry food. They need water. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you.
Okay, so we can continue on. So yeah, so microbes help in making many different foods. So I'm actually just going to, if you want to, go to Minty. Yeah, so we've got some few things coming through. Yeah, so the really good ones coming through. Got sourdough bread, definitely, because that's
Wow. Yeah.
sort of started from a culture. Wine, yes. So that's to make alcohol. So that's the same bacteria or the same fungus as from bread, but just in an anaerobic environment, so no oxygen. Yeah. Dosa batter. I don't know what dosa batter is. Ooh.
So dosa batter is more of an Indian dish, but absolutely it's fermented like through the night, and it uses rice and lentils as the base.
Oh wow, that sounds yummy. I'm gonna have to come to India and try it.
Yes.
Chocolate, yes. Yeah.
Curd, definitely.
Curd and kimchi, of course. Yeah.
Ice cream is really an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, my ice cream is still made from milk and cream, so there will definitely be microbes within that. Yeah. And bundi that.
Yeah, that's also a sweet. Again, an Indian sweet.
Yeah, and yogurt as well. Yeah, it can be made with lemon juice, but often made with bacteria. And again, it's that fermentation process. So it's that kind of stage before getting to cheese and the curds. Yeah.
Yes, I can see cake.
And really nice
Kimchi.
Cake. Yeah. Yeah.
All
so
right.
microbes are involved in all of these. It's
yes.
amazing.
Oh, you're on mute, Lorna. Sorry. Yes.
Really nice ideas there. Well done. And look, I've learned a few things as well. So yeah, microbes really are involved in lots of food. So we're just going to talk a little bit about some bad bacteria that may be involved, and this causes mostly food poisonings. So potential pathogenic bacteria. So we've got Listeria monocytogenes, which we've just talked about. It's particularly in soft cheeses and any cured meats. But in fresh meats, we're more likely to see some of the other ones. So Salmonella, you may have heard about. E. coli or Escherichia coli is found everywhere, but there are particular species or strains of E. coli that produce a toxin that causes food poisoning, particularly anything that has come into contact with cows. So it can be found in milk if it's not pasteurized. There's Campylobacter jejuni, which is in the UK the most common causing food poisoning agent. And there's another one called Clostridium perfringens. And this again causes food poisoning and other conditions, and is about the third most common in the UK for food poisoning. So Campylobacter jejuni is a gram-negative bacterium. Gram-negative means it's got a slightly different outer membrane structure. And it's important to know when trying to treat the bacteria and how it grows as well. If you eat a food product with this bacteria, symptoms appear after 2 to 5 days after ingestion of the contaminated food. And it takes about 400 to 500 bacteria to cause illness. Causes severe diarrhea, abdominal pain, malaise, which is generally feeling tired. In this case, I think luckily no vomiting involved usually. But just yes, an uncomfortable tummy for quite a few days with this one, and not a nice one. It's usually found in uncooked foods, or in if there's less if raw food has come into contact with cooked foods, and it can cross-contaminate that way. And then there's Salmonella enterica, and the picture shows what it looks like in the lab on a blood plate. So this is what's known as a colony, and that's lots and lots and lots of bacteria growing in one place. Okay. This is also a gram-negative bacteria, and it produces a toxin which causes the disease in the gastrointestinal tract, and is also found in raw foods and raw meats. Symptoms appear very quickly after ingestion of about 6 to 72 hours, and it's caused by only 15 to 20 cells, so it's really problematic. And it's also sometimes difficult to pick up in testing facilities. This causes diarrhea, quite often with blood in it, abdominal cramps, fever. You definitely get vomiting with this one, and headache. They're the common. So you really don't want to have this one in your dinner at all. And we actually have some options on how to prevent pathogenic bacteria. So we've talked a little bit about bacteriocins, and this is something that's becoming more and more used and looked into. So can we add bacteriocins, a natural way that bacteria compete with each other as well, to prevent some of these bacteria from growing in the food in the first place? Some of the work I'm doing is looking at bacteriophage, and this is where viruses come into food. We are looking at a product that is bacteriophage that actually stops Clostridium perfringens from growing within chickens, because Clostridium perfringens can hurt chicken. It causes illness in chickens, but it also causes food poisoning in us, and it also causes what's known as gas gangrene. So if you have a wound and it gets infected, it can cause gas gangrene, and there's gases go into the blood system. And it's a very unpleasant disease. So if we use viruses that target the specific bacteria, that can reduce the numbers of the bacteria that are possible to cause the infection in the first place. We also have vaccines. So for example, we've seen a reduction in salmonella infections because we vaccinate chickens against the disease. So we vaccinate chickens against salmonella so it doesn't go into their eggs. And it doesn't go into the chickens in the same way. So we're seeing reduced levels of salmonella infections happening, which is really great. And there's you can use antibiotics. Sometimes antibiotics can't always be used in food poisoning. Sometimes antibiotics can make things worse, so we have to use them with caution. And also with antibiotic resistance, we do have to consider use of antibiotics in the first place. So bacteriocins, bacteriophage, and vaccines are the more up-to-date research areas that we want to do rather than antibiotics at the moment.
So, Lorna, we have a question from Ananya, if we can take this before we wrap up.
Yeah.
The question is, are the microbes that are in our food the same as the ones that are in our gut that help us digest the food?
Yeah. Yeah, we absolutely need the same one. So that's why there's a lot of talk about probiotics. So it's, again, those yogurts and things with added bacteria to help. There is still some debate whether some of these foods and these bacteria are killed in the stomach acid. But a lot of the evidence does show that, especially if you have it in a fat-rich environment, you can actually see the bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So we're nearly there. So it's a complex world of microbes in food, and as we've seen in the word cloud, there's lots and lots of foods out there that really involve microbes. I've just touched on one or two examples. But we've seen that microbes are absolutely essential for food growth. They make food tastier. So we've seen that with cheese and kimchi and lots of other things. We need those microbes to make the flavor. Microbes in food can cause disease, and it can cause food spoils. So we have good bacteria that we absolutely have to have, and we have some bad bacteria that we want to reduce, but we can never actually get rid of because we still need them for something.
All right.
So, yeah.
So thank you, Lorna. So we do have one more question, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the link for this form in the chat window. So by that time, everybody else can fill in this link. We, again, now that you've learned about this complex world of food and microbes, we want to know what is your reaction now when you think of food and microbes. All right. So please go ahead. I will send you the link. You can also see it on your screen. If you feel like taking the link from there, that's fine. But I'm just going to put it into the chat window and everybody can fill it in. So this is the link in the chat window. While everybody is filling up this link, we have a question from Aaron, which I think is a very interesting question. So Aaron asks, can we have allergies to microbes? Are we allergic to microbes or some microbes?
That's a very good question. Okay, so we can have allergies to parasites. So the house dust mite is an example. So it's not necessarily an allergy, but there is two conditions. So there's Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, so that's in the gastrointestinal tract, and that is an immune response to your gastrointestinal microbes, microflora. And allergy is slightly different, but it is a similar kind of process. So yeah, you can have, some people will have a tendency. Will you have like a true anaphylactic shock type allergy? Not really. It's a tricky one, but not really. Or not that I'm aware of. It might be out there.
All right. Thank you so much for that. The other question in the chat window was, is there when microbes protect food from bad bacteria, can they also sometimes prevent some other good bacteria from growing on the food?
There is always that potential, yes. So niacin targets lots of different bacteria, not just Listeria potentially. But however, it's a bit of a competition. And if it's a good bacteria in particular, and it's reduced, that's all part of the wonderful world of microbes anyway. And so yeah, it's fun.
Thank you, everybody. And we will see everybody next week.